Good morning, boys and girls. Welcome back. We are so glad you're here. And all of the studying I was doing, I had to go back to November 17th. We finished up the book of Esther, and then we launched into all of our holiday lessons for Thanksgiving and Christmas. So as I was studying and I was going back and I was looking at where should we pick up and where do we head to next, at first I started in Nehemiah. Then as I was researching, I realized we had to back up from there, boys and girls. So we studied Daniel, and the book of Daniel finishes approximately 539 BC. There's some prophecy and different things in there, but roughly Daniel ends at 539. Then we jump to Esther. Now BC, meaning we're counting down actually to 0. Esther was 483 to 472. So then when I looked at Nehemiah, I realized Nehemiah comes after Esther. And then in my studying, I was like, oh wait, Ezra. We never covered the book of Ezra. And Ezra is actually before and after Esther. So to just kind of give you a reference point, we studied through the book of Daniel. We studied through the book of Esther. Now we're kind of coming back between those two books is where we're picking up. And then we have Ezra, Nehemiah, and then I think Job, and we can finally head to the New Testament after all of our studying in the Old Testament. So, boys and girls, I would like to cover Ezra chapters 1 and 2 this morning. We'll see how this goes, because chapter 2 is 70 verses long. Yeah. Now, boys and girls, about 63 of it is a list of names that I have no intention of reading through. For your listening sake and my speaking sake. But in Ezra chapter 1, so this is after the book of Daniel. Remember, with Daniel, the people are in captivity. And then we also talked about Esther not being in her homeland either. But Ezra is going to take some people back to their homeland. So in chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia," by the way, Cyrus, king of Persia, is mentioned in the book of Daniel. Daniel served under Cyrus. "That the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it also in writing, saying." So as the book of Ezra opens, it says that the Lord stirs up Cyrus's heart because something needs to be fulfilled that Jeremiah wrote about. So the stage is set. We know where we are as far as Cyrus being the king, and then that what Jeremiah prophesied would be fulfilled. So what is it that God stirred Cyrus's heart about? Well, in verse 2, we read about the proclamation. "Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he hath charged me to build him an house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah." He says, all that I have came from the Lord, and he's told me that we need to build a house for him in Jerusalem and Judah. Boys and girls, as we studied the book of Daniel, so you're going to have to go way back before the holidays. Before Esther, we did Daniel. Where are the furnishings or the vessels that belong in the temple? Do you remember Belshazzar from Daniel? Yeah, he was having a feast and he took those vessels and he drank out of them. And what happened to him that very night? Yeah, there was writing on the wall. That's right, Peter. And then he died that very night because he had taken the vessels that were for God's use for the temple and he had used them in a party. Well, now we've got Cyrus, who's the king, and he says God told him to rebuild the temple, to get that project started. And he realizes that he has all of those vessels. Well, continuing in verse 3, it says, "Who is there among you of all his people? His God be with you, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel. He is the God which is in Jerusalem." Again, we see Cyrus giving credit to God. Verse 4, "And whosoever remaineth in any place where he sojourneth, let the men of his place help him with silver and with gold and with goods and with beasts, beside the freewill offering for the house of God that is in Jerusalem." So Cyrus has commanded or said, God told me to rebuild the temple. So I'm going to send the people back. He sends the people, but then he also realizes they're going to need money. They're going to need funds. They're going to need materials to build. And he says, if you can't go back, give. Give what you have so that the temple can be rebuilt. Well, the people rose up, verses 5 and 6 tell us that. The people rose up and they go back to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. And they gave a lot of goods so that the temple could be rebuilt. In verse 7, it says, also Cyrus the king brought forth the vessels of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had brought forth out of Jerusalem, and had put them in the house of his gods. Even those did Cyrus king of Persia bring forth by the hand of Mithridath, the treasurer, and numbered them unto Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. So Cyrus says, wait a minute, you're taking all these goods back. I know that Nebuchadnezzar stole those vessels, so I'm going to make sure those get returned as well. Cyrus isn't just turning this over and telling someone else to do it. Cyrus is seeing to the details and making sure that they get done to the way that God wanted them done. In chapter 2, like I said, it lists out a lot of people. The captives are listed out, verses 1 to 63. In verse 64, it says, the whole congregation together was 42,303 score, beside their servants and their maids, of whom there were 7,337, and there were among them 200 singing men and singing women. Their horses were 736, their mules 245, their camels 435, their donkeys 6,720. Boys and girls, does God, one panda, okay? Does God care about details? He does. He just listed, if you looked at chapter 2, the beginning, all of those names. Then he gives a detailed account even of how many animals were taken back. God cares about the details. We're almost done, boys and girls. We've just got 3 more verses left in chapter 2. Verse 68, and some of the chief of the fathers, when they came to the house of the Lord, which is at Jerusalem, offered freely for the house of God to set it up in his place. They gave after their ability unto the treasure of the work 61,000 drams of gold, and 5,000 pound of silver, and 100 priests' garments. So the priests and the Levites and some of the people and the singers and the porters and the Nethinims dwelt in their cities, and all Israel in their cities. Boys and girls, the people went, they were ready to build, but they gave. They gave of their talents and their abilities. God used Cyrus, a king in a foreign land, to reestablish his temple. God used Daniel. We referenced him just in the beginning there, how we had talked about Daniel before. God used Daniel when he was in a foreign land. And God used the people. He used their talents, and he used what they were willing to give because they willingly obeyed. Boys and girls, we see that all of these willingly obeyed. Cyrus willingly obeyed. Daniel willingly obeyed. The people willingly obeyed. But what about you, boys and girls? Will you willingly obey God? And you're like, yes, I want to do great things for God. And then you might be like, but how do I do that? I'm not going to go build a temple, and I don't have gold and silver to give. Oh, boys and girls, God tells us in his word what he wants us to give, what he wants us to do, how he wants us to obey. Boys and girls, when you go about this week, God has already told you in his word to obey and honor your parents. He's already told you in his word to be kind. He's already told you in his word to not complain, but to give thanks. Boys and girls, as you go about this week, will you willingly obey what God has already asked you to do? I hope